Mike Lavelle, and he's got a slide that has his bio on it, so I'm not going to read one. Without further ado, Mike.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome back, and I'm back. What you're seeing up on the screen is the beginning of the cover screen for part 2. We had part 1 about a month ago or so. And I put this picture up here purposely. Does anybody recognize that picture?
There's nothing in it, is there?
Nothing in it? It's the Missouri, and it's in Tokyo Bay at the end of the war for the surrender. Remember in part 1 we had a quick slide that one of the conditions that the Allies agreed to was a surrender, a complete surrender, unconditional surrender of both Germany as well as Japan. And this kind of wraps it up. This is that completion of the objective of what the Allies wanted at the beginning. And so I just wanted to kind of give some credit to everybody who participated in that war, and which included the home fronts as well. So it was a war that everybody was involved in. And I thought this kind of shows that when you realize what that picture is. So with that, we'll go ahead and continue part 2. And what I'd like to do, that's my bio, you've heard it before. I'll do it real quick. 35 years between Cessna and Boeing. 10 years before that, and a whole bunch of aviation stuff. And then after I retired from Boeing, went to work for the Museum of Flight, spent 7 years there, left in 2012. After that, I've been doing things like this simply because I like to meet folks like yourself, and it's a lot of fun to do. So, that's the bio. Enough of that. Let's move on. We left Ike at an airfield. And at that airfield, of course, he was visiting the 101st. He wanted to visit probably every soldier that he would like to wish well. And here we had the summary of that. He was about ready to see these folks go off on 1,200 C-47s to a target area, which are going to be dropped ahead of the invasion itself, but roughly after midnight on June the 6th. This is just a representative picture. I like looking at these pictures, but I have a hard time sometimes when I'm talking in front of groups because I get kind of emotional when I look at these things. These are just young people ready to go to war. And if we look at them, they all seem to maybe want to be in the picture or not. And I often wonder, what happened to all those folks? Some could still be alive, who were killed in combat, and everything in between. I find it very interesting. In the front row, we see some Air Force personnel. Obviously, I think that's part of the crew, maybe of that C-47. And what caught my attention, the Air Force really wanted to be in the war, too. You know, they wanted to. Look at the fellow there with the cap on, who's holding an M1, I believe. He wants to be in there, and he's bringing his M1 with him. Because why? I don't know. Maybe he'll go down and want to shoot his way out. You know, who knows? But anyway, it's a great representative picture of the day and the time it happening. With that, they go to their target area. We talked about that a little bit in the last presentation. They're going to cover the flanks. The American groups would cover basically I guess that would be their right flank, and over on the left would be the 6th Airborne Division from the British would go in there. What happened when they dropped, the British had pretty good success with their drop, although they had a few missed drops. But the Americans had quite a bit. That group that we were looking at, they were part of that airborne force. And in the drop, they were dropped many miles from their targets, as we all know. That book was the paratroopers, the generals that jumped. It was Taylor and Ridgway. Anyhow, some of them were as far as 20, 30 miles away from their drop zone. Now, if you'll recall, when they briefed Churchill on the invasion plan on the 15th of May, prior to the invasion, one of the things he said, our greatest weapon will be our flexibility of our mind, meaning adjust to things that aren't going well. And like all plans, they don't go well. This is where these young men that we saw in the previous picture, the representative picture, applied that very principle. They were able to do that, and what they would do is bring themselves together, and they would form little groups, maybe 3, up to 5, up to 10, and have a leader and come together. The result was missing initially were over, it looks like here of the numbers anyway, around 4,000 troops were missing and coming together. A lot of action they had in the campaign itself, over probably 1,000 killed between the 101st as well as the 82nd. And if we look at the wounded, many of those as well. Some of those wound up as prisoners of war. But that was the beginning. Now, the thing of it was, it caused a great deal of confusion to the Germans, which was a good thing, but while they were getting themselves organized. So it was folks like that previous picture that we just saw that kind of brought that all together and made what could have been a disaster a success. I found an interesting number. I don't know how accurate it is, but I'm going to throw it out there. Somebody figured out the actual number of paratroopers that lost their life either in the airplane itself or jumping from the airplane and hitting the ground. It wasn't that many. It was like 58. And those are the folks that landed in that water or drowned and things of that nature. But after that, that was game on and they lost quite a bit. So they did their job and did it well. As far as the air cover on the morning of D-Day, it went on right up until the troops were hitting the beaches. And they had some successes and they had some things that were not so successful, such as on Omaha Beach, which I'll mention here in just a minute. But there were 12,000 missions or sorties flown that day by the Air Forces, Allied Air Forces. The Germans, and you hear numbers all over the place, they managed somewhere between, as it says up there, 100 to 250, and I found another number that said 350. It really doesn't matter. They weren't a big factor, and they were turned back. Some of them tried, but never got to the beach. They were turned back by the Allied Air Forces. The Allied aircraft lost were mostly, as you would imagine, C-47s. About 44% of them were C-47s. But there were also some fighters and fighter bombers that were lost as well. But minimal in terms of loss. I like to show this Point de Hawk, because Point de Hawk is an example of a well-bombed area. First of all, they had success there. It wasn't as fortified as Omaha Beach. And where this is located, Point de Hawk is about 25 miles from Utah Beach and 5 miles from Omaha Beach. And the Allies continued to bomb that because they thought there were large guns there. And there were initially. But the Germans moved them. So when the Rangers took Point de Hawk and got to the top, they didn't find the guns. They found telephone poles that looked like guns. And that's why the Allies continued to bomb that area. But the bombing was accurate there, and it's a good example of what bombing can do if you have the right conditions. In Omaha Beach, they did not. With that, the casualties at Omaha Beach were only about 253 KIA killed in action, and down in Omaha Beach it was 2,400. That's just the difference between right conditions and wrong conditions. And what I find also interesting about this, a big factor in the success at Utah Beach was the 82nd and 101st Airborne were behind that beach. There were no paratroopers behind Omaha Beach. So that was a factor as well. Now, this is the picture that is what I really like to refer to as the big war. The Allies really did a great job making equipment to fight the war. And it started even before we entered the war, as far as the Americans were concerned. But it really ramped up in 1941, became full blast in 43. So if you look at this picture, we realize there are a lot of naval participation from both sides to get troops in. It says something like 6,000 or 7,000 boats, and the landing craft around 4,000. The Allies, this picture was taken D-Day +5, which means 5 days after the initial invasions. And what you are looking at is a real traffic jam of all kinds of vehicles. Because you have airborne cover, as you see at the top. You have the barrage balloons that are covering the ships out there that are waiting to come in. And then you have the ships themselves at the beach waiting to offload. And when they offload, you have to kind of have a car park, if you will, where the equipment's going to go. The military police were going nuts because now they have to direct traffic coming from another car park into the battle area where this equipment is going. And this was going from sunup to sundown. And all this equipment was coming from somewhere. And remember, we talked about the Battle of the Atlantic? Think if that wasn't taken care of. You would not have this. So, you know, it's all kind of, the dots have to get connected and they come together. Well, there we are with that kind of activity. Now, the last time we talked, somebody mentioned the mulberry casements or the harbors that were built. This is an example of one. They were about 260 feet long, maybe 60 feet deep, 60 feet wide. And they were going to be drug across by tugboat or other means into the area to build up harbors, because one disadvantage of the beach areas that they were landing in, there are no harbors. They were going to get Cherbourg or the other one, but they didn't get it yet. Well, how that looked. This is kind of a great diagram of how that worked, and it really did work. You can see the casements there building at breakwater, and behind that they would have the piers, and from the piers you see those straight lines. Those were built roads from the pier to the beach itself. So you could offload all kinds of equipment from the ships that were coming in. And that took a while in which to put together. And then there was a huge storm, I forget just which day. It came around and it did more damage than any bombing from the Luftwaffe could ever imagine doing. So they had to put it back together, which they did. So they have the equipment now to get into and hold the beach area and move forward. That's the objective. This is now what the job of the tactical air forces are going to be. How do they support now, change their roles from the bridges and the railroads they're going after, and support the movement of the Army? One of the things that the Allies had, they had a way of working together that gave them flexibility, unlike the Germans. The German Luftwaffe were generally assigned to armies they support, and there was one commander who calls the shots. Not so with the Allies. This is a high-level explanation of it. What we're looking at, remember the phases of the Allied air campaign. The Allied air goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe. That started in 43 with the long-range bombing into Germany. Then isolate the battlefield. That was Quesada and the 9th Air Force, as well as the 2nd Tactical Air Force of the British. And then isolate post-invasion. And that's where we are now. What I've done here is put an organizational chart. Brereton was ahead of that operation for the Americans. Arthur Cunningham, a World War I ace with 21 victories. He was the British commander. Quesada was going to support Bradley. And they would have, even though their ranks may be different, they had equal command. And they got along well. Whalen, who trained under Quesada, was going to support the 3rd Army from Patton. Same situation. Patton drank the cool water. He would agree to anything just so he could get into the war. So he was there waiting, when can I go, when can I go? And he arrived, I believe it was August the 3rd or so. And now across the way, we have Broadhurst, who was going to work with Monty. And that's always a problem, no matter who works with Monty. I don't know if anybody's read the quote. Eisenhower was asked about his staff and what was it like working with Monty. And he said, well, if I was a soldier, I would want to be commanded by Monty. I would want to be under his command. If I was a peer and reported to him on his staff, and he was my peer, I could tolerate him. The last thing in the world I'd ever want to have happen, he'd report to me. And of course, that's what he got. And he was a bit of an issue that is far beyond the scope of this briefing. But nonetheless, you notice we disappeared Lee Mallory. He had no role now. So Lee Mallory was being sent off to another assignment to command the Air Force, the British Air Force in the East. And on the way, by the way, he was killed on the way there. But Arthur Tedder, there's a great book about this general. It's called Quietly in Command. And he just knew how to work with people and get them to cooperate, even though they did not necessarily care for one another. And there was plenty of that in operations like this. But he could somehow maneuver through all of that. So he played a big role in this. And the thing of it is, all of these people had an advantage. They all had worked together in North Africa and came together and understood roles and how to get along and trade ideas back and forth. They really had an advantage in that way. If we look at their arsenal that these air forces had for tactical support, they had quite a selection of weapons to use at the right place at the right time. And that was the idea of having one commander. What assets do you want to put to what jobs? And the Air Command would know better than what the Army Command would do and just get an agreement and go do it. But if we look at that arsenal, there's about 3,000 of these aircraft. These are great fighters. The Spitfire, was a wonderful fighter, as was the Mustang, great for strafing. And the Beaufighter. Is anybody familiar with the Beaufighter at all? That is a stout fighter. Mostly it was used as a night fighter, but it did its job and did it well. Then you have the medium bombers surrounded there, like the B-25, the B-26, the A-20, as well as the Mosquito. They did a great job as well. There's a lot of these, and these are the airplanes that were going to be used for that tactical support, as well as these two aircraft, the P-47 and the Typhoon. They were going to be gangbusters. The Germans hated these two aircraft. They just hated them because they seemed to be always present, always on them, to the point where travel by road for the Germans in the day was taking your life in your own hands. So that was what the Allies had to support the ground forces as they moved in. The other thing is people don't realize, not on the first wave or the second wave, but somewhere before the fifth wave, you had Air Force personnel from the British as well as the Americans in the invasion, bringing in equipment. They were setting up like radar, we had mobile radar that we would bring in, personnel to maintain aircraft, personnel to set up airfields. And this is an example of an Allied airfield. That could be a brand new airfield, or it could be a captured one from the Germans, but nonetheless, they had to occupy it, set it up, and get it operational. If we look at the first one to be available for operation was D-Day +4. Now, there was other flights from the battle area back to England. The first flight the Allies had was on D-Day around 4 p.m. in the afternoon. I believe it was off Omaha Beach. It was a light aircraft, a liaison aircraft that had been brought over in one of those ships, put together, and whatever they did, I'll take it at the end. Whatever they did, they would send liaison information reports back. Now, the thing of it was, you want these airfields for maintenance for a number of reasons. Obviously, to turn around airplanes, cut down flight time back and forth from England, which they're operating from initially. Here you can cut off 2 hours from a mission and use that for patrols, hovering, whatever you want to do. And it was important that you would get the airplanes back in the air. I love this shot of field maintenance. Now, they were used to that because they were doing that back in England as well. There was not enough hangars for everything to be put in unless you really, really need it. But I can't point, I don't know if this has a pointer or not. Let me say it somewhere. I always, yeah. Notice this guy right here, and this guy right here. They seem to be having a conversation. And the conversation, in my mind, would go something like this. How in the hell can they think of bringing everything other than one aircraft jack? Because that aircraft jack is sitting over here, pulling up the other wing. They didn't think of everything. One aircraft jack per airfield. Oh yeah, that's all. No, that really didn't happen, but this is, again, flexibility of mind, or more importantly, strength of your back. So let's use it. The material, though, that was being brought in, and the engineers putting it on there, was either 2 types of material, heavy wire that rolled out, or you could have these perforated steel plates. And they used that in the Pacific theaters as well. And those things up are quick. I mean, they could put those things up in a day or so if you had enough people. But imagine again, who's building all this stuff? Where did this come from? How did it work? And you know what? There's nobody with a laptop with any data sheets looking at things and seeing where things are. It was just there. It seemed to be. And of course, with all of this, nothing went right. Nothing went really according to plan. It was just the framework of the plan that caused it to happen, and good leadership down to the level of a private in some cases. Well, this is the number of airfields they actually built up. And the British zone had 31 at the end, as well as 50 for the Allies, and that was probably by the middle of August or so, that was kind of completed. And they would play a major role in pushing back the Germans who were going to counterattack. Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail of the attacks that, once the breakthrough was from St. Lo, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but I'll give you an overview. It's a fascinating story, and there's a lot of books that talk about all the detail down to individual platoons and individual squadrons. So this is just kind of an overview area that would fit into all of that. So as I mentioned before, these are the two aircraft, the Typhoon, as well as the P-47, that were doing a number initially and through the whole Normandy campaign on the Germans. And the Germans didn't quite know what to do about it. And here you just kind of see some examples of this aircraft that had taken care of a couple of targets on a road, and they would take care of them in short order. This is a great picture. This is a shot from a gun camera of a P-47 that rolled in on a truck. Unbeknown to the pilot that was rolling in on that truck was full of ammunition. And it hit and ignited the whole truck. That's his aircraft right here. The picture was taken by his wingman. He got out and he pulled out. In fact, I think this is even online. You can see the airplane all of a sudden do a maneuver that he wasn't planning to do, but he did it, he got out. So it was just devastating to anybody who was out there trying to move around, forming any kind of resistance or counterattack itself. This is another great shot. This was a building that was pointed out to the intelligence officers who got it to the Air Force. And this building happened to be the headquarters of Rumstad. Rumstad was the guy that Rommel reported to. Yeah, he does not have a happy look on his face. He wasn't there at the time, unfortunately, but that was his headquarters. But he was just flummoxed by the amount of air support and the aircraft that were overhead all the time. As a matter of fact, Rommel himself wrote home on June the 10th to a letter to his wife. He says, "This is just incredible, the superiority that the enemy has. We have no answer for it at all, other than don't travel during the day." And that was pretty well enforced. Rommel himself was strafed by a Canadian Spitfire, seriously injured. The driver was killed, sent him back to Germany, and where he had given the option, you served honorably, but to do that you have to take your own life, which he did. So that was the initial onslaught. Now, as good as all of that was, and all that was happening, and the superiority that the Air Force had in actually air supremacy, there was still an issue. And basically what that issue was, the front line had stalled down and wasn't moving much way forward by the end of June. As a matter of fact, if we look at the line from Cannes to St. Lo, it was about 10 miles off of where the beaches were, which is the top of the picture there. There were a lot of issues for that. Of course, the hedgerows and the thickness of them and the slowdown there, and Monty and his idea of how he interpreted the plan that he was supposed to follow, which he completely reversed in conversations. But nonetheless, it was an issue. And the issue, of course, was a stalemate, and you don't want to have that. Now, this is where it gets fun and the flexibility of mind. I say fun, where you have leadership. There's this great picture that came out when Bradley, Osada, and Eisenhower were trying to determine how can we break through. What do we need to do? And this was sort of captured in this shot. And they're discussing that. Well, who's the guy you expect to come up with some great idea because he always seems to, it doesn't care of the consequences? That would be Quesada. Quesada said again, I have an idea. When somebody says I have an idea and they've done it before, look out because you know something's going to come that hasn't been thought of before. Because Eisenhower made the remark in the meeting like this, I wish I could see it for myself what we're up against in this front. And that's when he said, I have an idea. What was that idea? Well, we'll get one of the repaired P-51s and we'll take out the radio gear and we'll put a bench seat back there, a pine board, and we'll stuff you, General Eisenhower, back in the back, which he did. And the scary thing about this is it was no seatbelt, it was just a board, no parachutes, there wasn't room. Quesada had a parachute, but that was used just as a cushion, not to bail out. But, and Eisenhower, the canopy had to be modified and it could only be opened and closed from the outside. Think of that. And off they went. They had air cover. Quesada did not have any ammo in his aircraft. They flew for about 40 minutes, and it's supposed to be super secret. Well, it was, but then again, when they landed, every camera from the military news people was there to greet them. And of course, they were both severely reprimanded. But can you imagine if something did happen? I mean, the only place they could have landed was behind enemy lines. Well, he got a picture of that, and this is where it came to some kind of hard, controversial decision. And that was, why don't we take a look at bringing the heavy bombers back and put them in a role to help break through. And they decided to be a role along that line, but primarily St. Lo. So, this was the survey of the battlefield. And ironically, they almost flew to an area that was going to be well known later on at the end of the Normandy campaign, which will address the Falsay-Argentan Gap. We'll take a look at that. All right, now what are we going to do? Well, this is the timeline when the heavy bombers went into use. And I only have 6 main missions here. Most of them were in the Caen area. And it was effective as they obliterated the town, and effective in the sense it drove the Germans out, but Monty didn't go back in and fill in the holes. The Germans came back in and filled the holes in. It just didn't move. Well, if we look at this, the missions, as it says here, had challenges, again, using heavy bombers for that use and the accuracy you want from them. It wasn't really there with the technology, but nonetheless, they used them, and the collateral damage was the big issue. Bradley, after it was all said and done, tried to write it off saying, yeah, we just weren't trained for that. That wasn't necessarily true. They had made some agreements, because once Eisenhower and Bradley decided to pose using these bombers, Bradley and Quesada would fly back to England to talk with the RAF and the Army, and those were some heated discussions. Basically, here are some of the points that would highlight those discussions. First of all, the Air Force wanted to fly a parallel bombing run on the front at St. Lo because they could place their bombs better in that manner. They would have less flak fields to deal with in that manner. That was their argument. That's what the Army wanted.
Yeah. Uh-oh, it went dead, didn't I? What happened here? Yeah, didn't I?
Okay, can we hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Well, the Army wanted the parallel runs because they felt there would be less collateral damage. I think I got that backwards on the previous comment. But the Air Force wanted the perpendicular run because that would give them less time over the flak field itself. The Air Force knew the heavies weren't that accurate, and that's the reason they wanted to do that, number one. And they would like the Army to back off from where they were currently located by about, it says here, 3,000 yards. Think of that. Who has the nerve or the guts to go up to an infantry commander and say, we're going to move you 3,000 yards back? You know, well, that's a sure way to either you're going to get killed or you're not going to do it. So anyway, the Army compromised and said, okay, we understand, we'll move back 1,200 yards. So that was agreed to. In the attack, it was going to be set for July 24th and 25th. The 24th, weather interfered with that, and then the 25th, it was carried out. So we'll just do a kind of an overview of, this is the line that we saw earlier from Caen to St. Lo, and where it was bogged down. The arrows after that is what we're going to be talking about after the results of that St. Lo raid, and the way both the Allies moved and then the Germans counterattacked with exiting after the counterattacks, where they were in retreat after their supposed counterattack called Luttich. Again, a blow up of that area, especially St. Lo. So top of the map is north. You have St. Lo. We have the front running. You had the American troops, the 7th, against the Panzer Lehr Division. So they would be on the south side of the road leaving St. Lo's. The Americans on the north. And here, this is an actual shot. I believe it was the 7th Army that was located there, looking at the bombers that were taking place at the time. Now, bear in mind, they thought the raid was going to be a parallel approach. The soldiers did. So 1,200 yards seemed awful safe to them. A lot of them moved up to within 800 yards. And that was what they did on the 25th. If we look, that was their expectations right there. And that would be the parallel approach. But the reality was they came back on the 25th and they had the perpendicular approach. And bombs were dropped, obviously. That was a long bombing raid. That went on for about 40 minutes or more. Continuous bombing. Because after the heavies were done, the B-25s came in, and the B-26s or whatever you had. So bombs were dropped, and 136 Americans died in that friendly fire, including General McNair. When Hap Arnold heard about that, or any of the marshal, he wanted to know what in the world was a general doing on the front line. Well, he wanted to see the action, and this is just right after he had a reprimand to Eisenhower. One of his generals gets killed in this bombing raid.
High school in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and he was going to support a division or so of Patton's Third Army. And he wanted to see if they were going to be moving out and that operation. 620 Americans wounded. Now, those are big numbers. The British had friendly fire bigger numbers with their raids on Caen. That's not talked about too much. Eisenhower, I liked his explanation of it. You basically say it's unfortunate. These are areas that we have to improve upon, which we'll do, but unfortunately, the only way to find out how you have to improve is you have to have the experience to do it. That's paraphrasing that. But that was a much better explanation than what Bradley was giving. This is the fellow who took the brunt of that. He was the commander of the Panzer Lehr Division. How do you pronounce his name? Berlin? Berlin, yes. And what he said, the German losses were primarily from the bombing, as well as artillery, then small fire. He was told when the bombing was going on, not to have anybody on his line give up an inch. And his reply, which was to Rumstead, he said, nobody has moved an inch. They're all dead. So it was effective in that regard. Pre-war assessment, as you would expect, it would say, overall, it was a bad luck, poor planning. It was not necessarily poor planning. There was some bad luck. Blame, enough to go all around, that's true. But Quesada said it best. He said at the planning meeting, it was short, it was quick, a lot of people talking. We had agreements. The problem was everybody heard what they wanted to hear. And that was just some of the which would cause a great deal of miscommunication. But the breakout did occur. Now I want to just talk about briefly the breakout and the results of that and what it led to. Let me go back one. This would set the stage, as they said, for the drive across Northern Europe of the Allies from the west to the east. And that's the beginning of it down there, and you see they're moving out on the 25th. Quesada had another idea too. Quesada and Bradley, as I mentioned before, they had experience together in North Africa. They respected one another, and they talked a lot with one another. And they would criticize each other, and they would call it, as they say, the spade. No sugarcoating. And Quesada criticized Bradley for not moving his troops, especially his tank divisions, fast enough. And Bradley said, well, we don't know where to go because we head out towards the target and we can't find it. And Quesada says, I have an idea. His idea was, get one of my radios, and this was more than one, of course, and we'll take it from the P-47 and we'll put it in a tank. And basically a tank commander said, I don't know what to do with that. No, you don't, but I'll give you an experienced Air Force pilot observer to put in the tank. Now, I just can imagine getting that assignment as a pilot, you know, sitting around the ready room, you better not look relaxed because they got a job for you. I don't know who got those jobs, but they would put them in the lead tank. Now the commander would have in the tank commander of that squadron of tanks, or what you call a group of tanks, would have communication to all his tanks. The experienced person knows what a target looks like, has flown over the area, can point out things specifically to the pilots that he was talking to, and that was devastating. And Quesada actually got this idea in North Africa from the British, what they called their mobile patrol cars. They would use cars for the same purpose. So that was working very well, and that would be a devastation added to what the Germans would be already suffering or suffering. I just like this shot. I was reading a book once, not about Quesada, but about the intelligence side of things. There was a fellow by the name of Donovan, the SS, and he ran into Quesada on D-Day on the beach. And they spent a couple of nights together, and things weren't moving well enough, and Quesada and Donovan, who he just met, said, let's go out and see if we can see something, what's the holdup is. And so they got a Jeep and left the line and went looking for the Germans. And they didn't hear a thing until they heard a tank coming. And the tank saw them and turned their turret right towards this Jeep. And you can't see it very well, but the picture, that's Quesada, that's Donovan, and you can see how this whole Jeep was blown apart. They bailed out before they were shot out off to the sides. Now they were lost. And they made their way back to the friendlies, laughing like a couple of schoolboys who didn't get caught with something they weren't supposed to be doing. So again, Quesada makes his mark. By the way, there's a great book about Quesada. It's just called Operation Overlord. That's all I can remember about it now, but it's pretty, it gives a good explanation of his character. Now, With the line now moving south from St. Lo, as we see here down to the Arvance, they were trying to hook up now with Patton, who would be coming in, and then they would go to the west, and then they would turn to the east. At the same time, Hitler has an idea. This is an opportune time to have a counterattack and beat the Americans who are already coming from the north at the location behind their lines. We'll call this Operation Luttich. And he would take off the line, he would take other German troops against his general's wishes. There wasn't one general that agreed to this. Hitler decided to do this. And besides that, the Americans are weak, they can't fight. They're brand new to combat. Some of that was true, but they forgot they were from places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Des Moines, across the country. And the only thing they wanted to do is fight and go home. And they put up a heck of a fight in the various units and divisions they were assigned to. Most of that fighting would occur south in an area called Mortain, as here. And this was a key crossroad area, and the Americans had a hill where they could see the Germans coming and call things out. The Germans stopped in this area wanting to take that hill. With that, of course, if you stop long enough, you're going to get air support, in which they did. Remember those airfields that we talked about? This is just an example. Again, this is a British number 5 airfield. You can see Mortain at the top of this illustration, right up there on the other side of the ridge. If you counted all those airplanes coming and going from the target, on the ground, being fueled, ammoed up, returning, just in a racetrack, that's about 48 airplanes or so. And what they were doing, of course, is going back to that target and supporting those folks on that hill. So the long and the short of it was, from St. Lo down to here, they started to push the Germans back in retreat. And the reason for that was the air support that they were providing. And they were driving it towards the False Argenton Gap. That would be the general retreat of the Germans themselves. Now, a lot of politics started to happen about this point within the Allies. How fast do you move? Where is Patton coming in? Patton is racing. I mean, it looks like an Indiana race course with tanks on it. The Germans finally start to retreat off the line from around Caen because the Canadians are starting to break through, followed by the British. And now everybody is kind of heading into this area, which is called the False Argentine Pocket. That's where the retreat was taking place, and they wanted to go further east and south into Germany. And now with that, General Patton in the 3rd Army is coming along, and his whole right flank is open. No, it's not, because Whalen is there with the 19th Tactical Air Force covering the right flank. It wasn't another Army division, it was the Air Force that was covering the right flank. The Germans had nowhere to go. This is a picture of now these Typhoons, the P-47s. They're in what they call a race course pattern, just flying around in circles. When I lived in England for 3 years, and my next door neighbor was a Typhoon pilot, and he participated in this. He said he had a number of missions, not many, because he got there a little later, about 20 missions or so. And of those, he probably went in 8 times to a target. But he said it was brutal for the Germans, absolutely brutal. What was taking place, they'd be called into that area that we just looked at, and I'll blow it up here. They were hemmed in because on one side, it was about 12 miles to the Argenton area where the road was left open. Bradley, Patton, everybody wanted to close it. They could have maybe even ended the war there, but for political reasons between the powers that be, and it's more detailed than I can explain right now, but you know, they wanted to get the British involved as well. So when the Canadians broke out, that was a sign that they were at least on the move. They came back in with a lot of firepower in this area between the Orne River and the Dives River. And the Germans were trying to escape through that gap into Germany. One of the things they were doing, they were looking for ways off this main road. This would be the road to Baccarat, if you will. They were trying to go take side roads into these areas and go the back way. And the only way they could do that was have somebody lead them. A lot of the French resistance, or some of the French resistance, would pose as farmers to volunteer to do that. And they were taking down roads that were open, and they know they could be trapped there. And I'll show you why. Here they are retreating, and with that you're calling in your air forces, and this is why they wanted to get off that main road. The Allies were bombing the heck out of that road, and 24/7, almost 24/7. In fact, at night they would. They would shoot flares at night and continue to do that. And what was happening, they had to cross a bridge that would be open, and this is in that area, and the bridge was taken out. And you can see this is what they would do. They had nowhere to go. You can see, if you look very closely, you can see some shadows of vehicles in various places trying to take cover. Some got through, got away. But this is what it generally would look like. There's more gruesome shots than this. This is mostly dead horses, which points out another thing. The German army was poorly mechanized. They used horses and wagons to get troops to where they had to go. The Americans and the British were highly mechanized by this point. But you can see the carnage. That neighbor that I talked about said the drill was you take one of the aircraft and shut it down in the front and go to the back, and then the others come in and just strafe it up or rocket it up. And that would leave when they would do, that's why they couldn't get out. This was their tragedy, because these roads were generally below the land onto the sides, which was being used for agriculture of some sort. So it was below that land, they couldn't get themselves up and out. So this is a county, as I say, a country road east of Moissy, France. The Allies would come in. And by this time, it was pretty much over for the German army in the Normandy area. They would escape a lot would escape, and I have basic figures here to show you, to Germany to fight again, and again they would. But that was some heavy fighting in there. By the end of August the 21st, you were seeing scenes kind of like this. The armies from the German side were surrendering in regiments and in divisions, in groups of 2,000 to 3,000. Overall statistics, and there's a lot of them here, and you can get them in just about any book. The problem is you can't get any definitive one, because they're kind of all over the place. The one that's interesting, how many returned to Germany and got out of Germany, was anywhere from 50,000, one source says, to about 250,000. It doesn't much matter. It could have been a lot less if they were allowed to go in there earlier and take out the Germans as they were initially retreating from the Following Gap. Another interesting statistic is the bombs dropped by the Allies on their enemy during this time frame, almost 200,000 tons of bombs. The Germans managed 18,000 tons, which were mostly the V1, V2 rockets at that time. So that's a sign that you're gaining strength, you're getting the job done. You can see the number of POWs and what have you. This picture, by the way, everybody has a D-Day story, right? I have a D-Day story. I first saw this picture for the very first time when I was 16 years old. I got my driver's license that day. It was Saturday. And the reason I saw that picture, I was going to take a girl out that I met in 3rd grade. And now I think I was a sophomore, maybe a junior in high school. I have to figure it out. But she went to a different high school, but I re-met her, and I wanted to take her out, and I was going to be able to drive. This is her big deal. I don't know if any of you can remember It's a big deal to have a car, take a girl out. And I knocked on the door, and her father answered the door. This is a true story. And he greeted me with a dog and a leash. And he said, take the dog for a leash, or take the dog for a walk, and if he doesn't bite you, I'll let you in. And so I watched that dog closely, and he didn't bite me. And I went in, and he escorted me to what we call a man cave now. It's just a little area, it's not a big house at all. And this picture was on the wall. And I was interested in that sort of thing. And I said, oh, is that the German army surrendering at some point? He said, yeah. I said, wow. His name was Callahan, by the way. And I was afraid to ask, are you in it? Because Coffin's kind of a German name, it's really a Czech name. And he says, yeah, I am. I said, well, which one are you? And he said, I'm the guy right here, standing on the Jeep. Now, he wasn't in the initial wave of the Normandy invasion, but it came later. And he was at this point, and his some sergeant from the German army came in under a white flag saying his colonel wanted to surrender. The commander told this guy right here, go out and see what he wants. He said he wants to be assured that he fought by, yeah, we'll say that. Anyway, the whole thing surrendered. And this is him coming back behind the lines to surrender. So what this guy who gave me the orders to take his dog for a walk, neither he nor I knew 5 years from that day he'd be my father-in-law. and the thing of it is, he didn't talk much about the war except later on with me. We talked quite a bit about it, and mostly his big engagements were in the Battle of Lavelle, Remagen Bridge, and that route. Then he had to be assigned to the war trials in order to get the points to come home. That's why he was glad that thing happened in Japan where they surrendered too. He didn't have to go eventually after that. Anyhow, that's my D-Day story. The other thing he asked me, he says, when I got there, he says, how long have you been driving? All fathers want to know, how long have you been driving? And I didn't want to, I got it on my 16th birthday, I said, 2 years. And he said, really? I said, yeah, really. He said, how do you figure that? Well, I said, this is 1959, and I got my learner's permit in 1958. Oh, Philadelphia wise guy, are you? So anyway, that was the conversation. Oh, the other also said, when do you plan to be home? I said, 10:30. He says, make it 10. Yes, sir. Anyway, this is a shot of Eisenhower in 1951. I love this shot because obviously he's contemplating and looking back, or that's the idea behind this whole thing. And you can see some of the remnants of the mulberry harbors in the background there. In 1944, June 6th, we have a gentleman, I understand, who got his commission on that day in the group here. But on that day, his son graduated from West Point. By the 24th of June, he was visiting his father. And he wanted to demonstrate to his father how much he knew and learned at West Point. And he said to his father, you'd never get away with this if you didn't have air superiority. Like that's a newsflash to him, you know? And he said something very polite, I guess, or it's quoted very polite. If I didn't have air superiority, I wouldn't be here, you knucklehead, you know? But anyway, it's all because of what he thought about often. And these folks that did it for us. And so, with that in mind, I'd just like to say, in closing, that was the Allied air support. Before, and after, and during D-Day, and I'd like to thank everybody who's ever served, will serve, or is going to serve, for what they do for us. And that is it. I'll take questions now.
set up to be Grasshopper aircraft carriers off Normandy. And that was
Whoa.
one thing I was gonna mention, it's a little known fact, but it was pretty neat the way they set that up.
They thought of everything.
I've got photographs of that.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
awesome.
have them. And the light aircraft are Pipers, for that, Stinsons,
Yep.
Roncas, all
And
kinds.
by the way, both Patton and Eisenhower were qualified pilots in those Grasshoppers.
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing. One question though is that you don't mention the P-38s, and actually, my understanding is that Doolittle overflew the beaches on the morning of June 6th in a P-38. You flew a P-38 specifically because it had 2 engines.
Yeah.
But also, nobody could mistake a P-38 for anything else
Yeah.
but a P-38.
I've not heard that before. I'd like to look that up. P-38s were in that picture, though, that I first showed
Right.
but that wasn't the D-Day shot. That we used that for a kind of a bookend thing.
Okay.
Yes, any other questions? Yes.
This is not a question, but the radio that was in that tank was made by Satchel Carlson. Satchel Carlson was Mr. Satchel and Mr. Carlson, and the company was founded in St. Paul.
Really?
Yeah, after the war, they moved to New Brighton and started making
Cool.
TVs.
I'm learning about my new state now more and more.
My mother and dad insisted in having Satchel Carlson TVs.
Yeah, that's a big brand.
I dated Carlos Vidar.
Hey, that's even better.
And I just heard about them today. In the back.
Yeah, just to reinforce your point, the 361st Fighter Squadron of the 8th Air Force posted what they did on D-Day, and it was really amazing how many sorties they flew in one day.
Yeah.
And they had gun cameras to prove what they did, but they shot up 12 locomotives on D-Day.
Yeah.
And that was,
all over the place.
yeah.
And it's interesting, as you probably know, when you read these books about D-Day, most of them mention air support, but they don't go into great detail of air support. Ambrose's book, I think is the one I read, the troops wanted to know, rightfully so, where is the air support? Well, it's been taken care of. Now, the beach is yours, so that type of thing. But it's just fascinating to me how all this was done, It really, I don't understand it. I mean, I have a hard time keeping 4 people that are related to me, my sons and wife, informed. How do you keep it?
I find it so interesting that Kessa is just there's not that many, there's not a lot of books out on it.
Who's that?
General Kessa.
Yeah.
That book Overlord, we actually did a program. Tom Hughes actually did a book called Overlord.
Yeah, that's the one I referred to.
And our roundtable, we actually had Tom up and did a program. I think it's on our webpage. Tom Hughes, the Caseta story, but for the veteran, we actually had
Wow.
Dahlberg,
Wow.
who had a lot of
Yeah.
Caseta stories with.
Well, he was quite the character. Of course, after he left the Air Force, he didn't necessarily agree with the concepts of Vandenberg and that sort of thing. But he had a successful career after that. The FAA, now the airline pilots didn't appreciate him because he lowered the retirement age to 60. But then he left that and joined development. And what is that square in Washington D.C.? Alfonso Square? Say that again. Yeah, La Enfant. He was behind that and head of the corporation of that. So he did fine. There's another book out too that's a fun book to read. Has nothing to do per se specifically with D-Day, but it has a lot to do with World War II. Way back when, in this first part of the program, I mentioned a fellow by the name of Zimmerman, Solly Zimmerman. And he was a medical doctor and did a lot of strategic planning with the Allies and knew all these airmen and what have you that we've been talking about. Well, he wrote a book called Warlords and Apes. It is great. It's about the personalities of Churchill and Roosevelt and all the people he dealt with in the military at a high level, and also his research and development in anthropology and what have you, and kind of melds the two together of similarities and dissimilarities. And it's about that thick. So it's called Warlords and Apes, and I don't remember who the author is. I have it, but I don't remember the author.
We need to talk about it.
Pardon me?
We'll talk.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, well, thank you very much, folks. It's been a pleasure doing this.